Washington spent months thundering about fiscal discipline, then quietly slipped $16 billion into earmarks, like a magician palming a coin. Conservatives shouted, threatened, postured, and when the shutdown clock hit Friday, they blinked. Roads were paved, police cars ordered, local projects blessed, all while Congress swore this was nothing like the earmarks they once called corruption. Somehow the money passed, the government stayed open, and the outrage evaporated. This was not a budget accident. It was a deal, carefully wrapped in urgency and fear. So here's the question. If conservatives hate earmarks so much, why do they keep saving Congress with them? And who is really being fooled? The fight over earmarks was framed as a moral crusade, but it was doomed the moment it began. Fiscal conservatives marched into the winter vowing to block government funding, unless Republicans finally practiced what they preached. No more pet projects, no more hometown trophies, no more spending masquerading as virtue. The language was absolute, theatrical, and uncompromising, and that was precisely the problem. In Washington, absolutism is not a strategy. It is a confession of weakness. As the shutdown deadline loomed, the House Freedom Caucus thundered about discipline and debt. Chip Roy called earmarks the currency of corruption. Ralph Norman labeled the spending package irredeemable. Rick Scott demanded the Senate follow its own rules and end the practice entirely. The rhetoric sounded fierce, but the math was merciless. Agencies were days from running out of money. Markets were watching. Federal workers were bracing for furloughs. The Pentagon was stuck in budgetary limbo. In that environment, moral purity becomes a luxury item, and Congress does not do luxury under pressure. Conservatives were not just fighting earmarks, they were fighting time. Leadership understood that reality better than the hardliners ever did. When the choice narrowed to accepting local projects or triggering chaos across most of the federal government, the outcome was never in doubt. Principles do not keep the lights on. Votes do, and votes in a narrowly divided Congress are expensive. The conservatives demanded leverage they did not actually possess. They threatened to tank procedural votes, slow the process, embarrass leadership. What they could not do was offer an alternative that avoided catastrophe. There was no parallel funding plan, no viable path to 60 Senate votes, no realistic way to hold the line without absorbing blame for a shutdown. Their resistance was loud, visible, and ultimately symbolic. In Washington terms, that means it was already lost. The irony is brutal. The same lawmakers who despise earmarks rely on the political stability those earmarks quietly purchase. Local projects grease the gears of compromise. They soften ideological edges. They give lawmakers something concrete to defend back home when voters ask what Congress actually accomplished. Strip that away, and what remains is gridlock, not virtue. The final humiliation came in the votes themselves. Conservatives forced showdowns to eliminate earmarks and watched them fail overwhelmingly. One high-profile project was cut, $1 million tied to a questionable address, and then the rest sailed through untouched. More than 70 House Republicans voted to keep the Senate earmarks intact. The moral war ended not with a dramatic defeat, but with a shrug and a roll call. This was never about corruption versus integrity. It was about whether Congress could still function under deadline stress. Earmarks survived because they solved a problem ideology could not. They turned resistance into cooperation and outrage into signatures. Conservatives did not lose because they were wrong about spending. They lost because in modern Washington, refusing to compromise is not a weapon. It is a surrender disguised as courage. Earmarks did not storm back into Congress waving flags and demanding forgiveness. They returned quietly, polished, rebranded, and carrying a compliance checklist. The practice that Republicans once buried in 2010 amid scandal and Tea Party fury did not resurrect itself as a villain. It came back as a consultant. Samey function, better optics, and a carefully tailored suit. When Democrats regained control of Washington in 2021, they did not revive earmarks by name. They knew the word still smelled like bribery and backroom deals. Instead, they rolled out community project funding, a phrase so sanitized it could pass a focus group in a hospital waiting room. The money did exactly what earmarks always did, targeted federal dollars to specific districts for specific projects. The difference was presentation. Caps were imposed. Transparency rules were announced. For-profit entities were banned. The total was limited to 1% of discretionary spending. The message was clear. This was not corruption. This was governance with guardrails. Republicans scoffed publicly and studied it privately. For 2 years, they watched how the system worked. They saw that the scandals did not return. They noticed that the deals moved faster. They observed that leadership could actually pass funding bills without lurching from crisis to crisis. When Republicans retook control of Washington, the supposed guardians of fiscal purity faced an awkward truth. The machinery they once condemned was now the only thing keeping Congress functional. The numbers tell the story better than any speech. The nearly $1.3 trillion funding package moving through the Senate this week is loaded with thousands of earmarks totaling almost $16 billion. Roads, police equipment, flood control, local infrastructure, not vanity projects, but politically useful ones. The money is spread widely enough to avoid backlash and specific enough to secure loyalty. This is not sloppy spending. It is precision spending. The rebrand worked because it exploited a deeper institutional fear. Congress has spent years watching the executive branch redirect, delay, or cancel funds lawmakers approved. Under President Trump, that tension intensified. Earmarks became less about indulgence and more about control. By specifying projects down to the zip code, lawmakers boxed in federal agencies and reclaimed a sliver of the power of the purse. The suit was not just cosmetic, it was armor. Critics still call it legalized pork. Supporters call it accountability. Both are partially right. What changed is not the behavior, but the narrative. Earmarks are no longer sold as favors. They are sold as stability. They are framed as the lubricant that prevents total legislative seizure. That framing matters in a Congress where every vote is a hostage negotiation. The brilliance of the comeback lies in its banality. There is no scandal headline, no infamous bridge, no gold-plated absurdity, just line items, committees, deadlines, and signatures. Earmarks did not ask to be loved. They only asked to be tolerated. And in a Washington addicted to crisis, a tool that reduces chaos will always find a way back inside, no matter how many times it was declared dead. The most uncomfortable truth in Washington is also the most reliable one. Earmarks buy peace, not harmony, not trust, not bipartisanship in the civic textbook sense, but something far more valuable under deadline pressure: silence. Compliance, votes. When Congress is staring at a shutdown clock, earmarks are not decoration. They are currency. Listen closely to how supporters defend them, and the moral argument evaporates. They do not talk about ideals. They talk about outcomes. Mike Flood does not apologize for securing nearly $30 million for his Nebraska district. He lists projects: roads repaved, police cruisers purchased, a youth shelter upgraded so minors avoid detention. The message is brutally practical. This is what a yes vote looks like back home. This is how compromise survives re-election season. Leadership understands the arithmetic. In a narrowly divided House and a Senate constrained by the filibuster, every funding bill is a high-wire act. You cannot muscle it through. You cannot shame it into existence. You assemble it piece by piece, district by district, until the votes line up. Earmarks turn abstract trillion-dollar numbers into tangible wins that lawmakers can defend to skeptical voters. That transformation is the peace offering. The irony is thick. Fiscal hawks condemn earmarks as waste while quietly benefiting from the stability they create. Without them, funding bills stall. Without funding bills, shutdowns erupt. Shutdowns punish federal workers, rattle markets, freeze military planning, and hand the narrative to the opposition. Earmarks interrupt that chain reaction. They lower the temperature just enough for signatures to appear. This is why the argument that earmarks inflate spending falls apart under scrutiny. In this case, they did the opposite. Supporters point out that the final package keeps overall federal spending mostly flat. The projects were not piled on top of runaway growth. They were embedded within a deal that leadership could sell as restraint. The earmarks were the sweetener, not the excess. Behind closed doors, the bargaining is blunt. You want a bridge? I need your vote. You want flood control. I need you quiet on the floor. This is not poetic, but it is effective. Congress does not run on speeches, it runs on incentives. Earmarks align those incentives faster than any ideological appeal ever could. Critics like to pretend there is a clean alternative, a version of Congress where lawmakers vote purely on principle and budgets glide through on moral consensus. That Congress does not exist. The real one is transactional, deadline-driven, and allergic to pain. Earmarks reduce pain. They give members something to lose if they blow up the deal. Even the resistance proves the point. When conservatives forced votes to strip earmarks, the measures collapsed. Not narrowly, overwhelmingly. The appetite for confrontation disappeared. The moment lawmakers calculated the cost, peace was cheaper than purity. The dirty secret is not that earmarks are popular, it is that they are efficient. They transform ideological stalemate into legislative movement. They keep the government open when principles alone would slam it shut. In a city addicted to chaos, earmarks are the quiet bribe that keeps the machinery humming. And as long as peace is required to pass a bill, Congress will keep buying it. Washington did not lack opposition to earmarks. It lacked consequences. What unfolded over the funding fight was not a rebellion but a performance. Carefully staged, loudly advertised, and safely contained. The resistance was real in tone and hollow in effect, a political theater designed to be seen rather than to succeed. Hardline conservatives demanded votes to strip earmarks, knowing exactly how those votes would end. The motions were doomed before they hit the floor. Leadership allowed them anyway. This was not generosity, it was strategy. By granting symbolic showdowns, leaders gave dissenters something priceless, proof they fought. Cameras rolled, statements flew, principles were declared. And when the votes failed, everyone moved on, liberated from the burden of actually winning. The clearest example came with the removal of a single earmark. A $1 million project tied to Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar. The justification was procedural, the address questionable, the optics irresistible. Conservatives claimed a victory. Leadership shrugged. The remaining billions stayed untouched. One sacrifice satisfied the crowd and protected the deal. In Washington, that is not hypocrisy. It is choreography. Figures like Scott Perry and Rick Scott amplified the drama. Social media posts thundered about garbage spending and broken promises. Demands to end earmarks now ricocheted across cable news. Yet, when the final package arrived, the outrage softened into resignation. More than 70 House Republicans voted against killing the Senate earmarks. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened into farce. The resistance also served another purpose. It shifted blame. By forcing votes they knew would fail, conservatives created a paper trail. They could tell voters they tried. Leadership could tell donors the government stayed open. The minority party could claim leverage. Everyone escaped with a talking point. No one escaped with clean hands. This pattern repeats because it works. In a narrowly divided Congress, open revolt is risky. Losing publicly but loudly is safer. It preserves brand identity without endangering outcomes. Theatrics replace leverage. Anger substitutes for power. The audience gets a show, not a result. The most revealing moment was not the speeches, but the silence afterward. Once the funding package passed, the fury dissipated. There was no sustained campaign, no walkout, no refusal to cooperate on the next vote. The resistance ended exactly where it was designed to end, at the microphone, not the ballot box. This is how modern congressional dissent survives. It is visible enough to energize a base, and controlled enough to avoid consequences. Earmarks did not survive because opponents lacked arguments. They survived because opposition had boundaries. The rebellion was approved, scheduled, and ultimately harmless. The theater of resistance comforts voters by suggesting someone is still fighting the system. The system, meanwhile, keeps functioning exactly as intended. In Washington, real power is quiet, boring, and effective. Noise is optional, failure is acceptable. Success, when it threatens stability, is quietly voted down. Earmarks did not return simply because Congress missed them. They returned because power was slipping away. Under President Donald Trump, lawmakers in both parties watched the executive branch freeze, redirect, or outright ignore billions of dollars Congress had already approved. Funds were delayed, priorities were reshuffled, Agencies took cues from the White House instead of Capitol Hill. For an institution built on the power of the purse, this was not just irritating, it was existential. Earmarks became Congress's counterpunch. By specifying projects in painstaking detail, lawmakers reduced the room for executive maneuvering. Money tied to a road in Nebraska or flood control in Alabama is harder to cancel than a vague line item buried in an agency budget. This was not nostalgia, it was self-defense. As one senior Republican appropriator put it, earmarks restore a measure of institutional faith in Congress's ability to direct spending. Translation, stop the president from freelancing with their money. The timing matters. These earmarks are the first of Trump's presidency, following nearly 2 years of stopgap funding that left agencies operating on autopilot. Continuing resolutions kept the lights on but surrendered control. Nothing new, nothing targeted, nothing enforceable. When full funding finally returned, Congress made sure it came with strings attached. Earmarks were those strings. Publicly, Republicans argued about discipline and decorum. Privately, many were relieved. Earmarks gave them leverage not only over Democrats, but over the administration they nominally supported. This is the quiet deal no one advertised. Conservatives could rail against spending while enjoying the protection earmarks offered against executive overreach. Democrats could secure projects while reinforcing congressional authority. Leadership could pass a massive funding package and avoid a shutdown. Everyone gained something. No one called it a truce. The tension with Trump sharpened the calculation. An unpredictable executive changes the risk profile of inaction. Without precise instructions, agencies become political actors. Congress loses relevance. Earmarks, once mocked as pork, became tools of resistance disguised as cooperation. They were a way to say yes to funding while saying no to unilateral power grabs. This reframes the entire debate. The $16 billion was not simply about bridges and police vehicles. It was about who decides. The power struggle between branches turned earmarks from embarrassment into armor. The hypocrisy critics point to is real, but it is also strategic. Congress chose influence over purity. The quiet deal was never written down. It did not need to be. It was understood. In exchange for tolerating earmarks, lawmakers regained control over how money moves. In exchange for accepting some ideological discomfort, conservatives avoided another shutdown and constrained an assertive executive. In exchange for cooperation, the government kept functioning. This is the final irony. Earmarks survived. Not because Washington forgot its past scandals, but because it feared a future where Congress no longer mattered. The deal everyone made was not about spending, it was about survival. And in a city where power is always under negotiation, survival always wins.